The Titanic is the most famous naval disaster in history. The Lusitania, lost just off the coast of Ireland in the First World War, was influential in swinging American opinion against the German U-boat campaign. The mighty Hood blew up under fire in the Denmark Straits, engaging the Bismarck. Now, these naval catastrophes are etched both in the public consciousness and the military record. And yet, the greatest naval disaster in British history, where the loss of life was greater than the Titanic, the Lusitania and the Hood combined, is barely remembered at all. For it is here, just a few miles off the port of Saint-Nazaire in Brittany, that on the 17th of June 1940, the Lancastria was sunk with a minimum loss of over 4,000 souls, both civilian and military. And so in two special programs for Remembrance Day, we chart the history of the Lancastria. We speak to the last few remaining survivors. We speak to the relatives of those who perished and those who survived. We speak to the campaigners about their long struggle for remembrance. And we try to answer the question of why the greatest naval disaster in British history has been confined to the hidden vaults of history. You know, they say the sea is cruel, but perhaps not quite as cruel as those who have denied remembrance to so many for 78 long years. In June 1940, Prime Minister and war leader Winston Churchill faced huge strategic problems, but had grasped a glimmer of light in the otherwise totally bleak military landscape. France was on its knees and had crumbled in the face of the Nazi onslaught in a matter of days. The British forces were a beaten army, evacuated in chaos and confusion from the beaches of Dunkirk. However, by a combination of luck and bravery, much of the expeditionary force had escaped intact, running away but surviving to fight another day. To their great surprise, this broken, chastened army returned to a hero's reception. For Churchill, in a series of oratorical triumphs, had snatched the illusion of victory from the reality of defeat. But barely 2 weeks after Dunkirk, and on the very day of the official French surrender, news came through of a further devastating naval loss. Churchill was told about the loss of the Lancastria, a news story that no amount of spin could present as anything other than an unmitigated and bloody catastrophe. And so the Prime Minister decided that this was one disaster too many to be reported. No mention of the loss was made by either newspapers or radio. Surviving soldiers and seamen were ordered to keep quiet. It was as if the Lancastria was still afloat and the 4,000 dead were still alive. I pick up the story with two campaigners who have fought to restore the memory of the fate of the Lancastria. I'm now delighted to be joined by Mark Hurst, a long-term Lancastria campaigner, and Michel Uxaby, a local historian here in Saint-Nazaire. Mark, if I can come to you first, what was the Lancastria doing here in Saint-Nazaire that fateful day in June 1940?
Well, the Lancastria had been commissioned as a troop ship at the outbreak of war, and she was actually just finished the disembarkation of troops from the Norway campaign when she got orders to sail to Saint-Nazaire and help in the evacuation.
So she was a Cunard liner, which was requisitioned as a troop carrier.
Yeah, she was requisitioned. She cruised the Atlantic in a peacetime role, taking wealthy passengers across the Atlantic. She also did some Mediterranean cruising. But when the orders came through, she was actually in Nassau in the Bahamas and was sent to New York, painted battleship grey, and then onwards to the UK to take a full part in the war, in troop movements.
And Michel, you were actually around just down the road in 1940 as a 10-year-old boy, and you witnessed the chaos and the confusion of the troops trying to find a way out of France and the refugees looking for somewhere to go.
It was really unbelievable. It was impossible to drive on the roads. They were full of refugees coming from the north of France, coming from Belgium, coming from Netherlands. And, well, it was really impossible to drive. So the troops and the civilian people, they did what they could do. And they had a ship going back to England, and they tried to embark on this ship. And I think the captain tried to have the navigation as safe as possible, and he was waiting for an escort.
Captain Sharp decided not to sail in the afternoon
That's
because he was waiting for a destroyer escort. He was frightened, obviously, of U-boats sinking his ship in the channel.
And well, it's easy now to say he made a mistake, but I was a captain for myself. I don't know what I would have done at this moment.
Mark, of course, you have a family connection because your grandfather was aboard the Lancastria. Tell us a bit about his story, what happened to him.
Well, he arrived here late on the night before the embarkation out to the Lancastria and slept in the streets here in Saint-Nazaire. And his unit were actually sent out late in the afternoon. They were one of the last units to board the Lancastria. And he actually sought refuge on the top deck. And because he was a non-swimmer, he spotted a life jacket. But initially he didn't think it would save his life. He took the life jacket because he thought it would make a good pillow for the long journey back. But that was a fateful decision for him, obviously, because shortly afterwards the Lancastria was attacked.
And your grandfather's name was?
Walter Hurst.
And did he speak much about in his later days? Because you'd know him as growing up, and did he tell you about what had happened that day?
Well, he lived with us in the latter years of his life, and he would describe what happened. And when he eventually made it into the water, he was there. He wasn't a swimmer, so he tried to stay as still as possible. And out of nowhere, a dog appeared, and he grabbed the scruff of the neck to pull him away from the suction of the boat.
And we know this dog may well have been, from other accounts, the pet of some of the Belgian children refugees.
That's right.
Who had boarded the Lancastria.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand, but there was not just troops coming into Saint-Nazaire, there was hundreds of refugees. Many of them, like these children, had walked all the way with their dogs. Sadly, though, we know that these children who did board the Lancastria with their dogs, sadly they didn't make it.
But the dog intervention was very helpful to your grandfather.
Helped my grandfather, but he was still very much haunted by what he saw. It's difficult to imagine what happened out there in the estuary. There was many ways to die that day, and I think the horror, in some ways, for the survivors lived with them for many years. And I know from my own experience, speaking to many survivors since, that they had nightmares well into their 80s and 90s throughout their life about what happened.
And for many years afterwards, remains of bodies were being washed ashore. Fishermen were catching the bodies in the nets.
Little by little, well, they found some body, but difficult to know who they were and how many. They are in the department of Vendée now, but all along the coast they were. And maybe some are still down in the bottom of the sea.
So thank you so much, Michel, for that first-hand account of the confusion and horror of that time. For appearing on the show, can I present you with the Alex Salmond Quaich, the Quaich's the Loving Cup, a cup of remembrance, perhaps. You know the drill. Vous savez quoi faire? Whiskey in the Quaich, and only Scotch whiskey, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope my wife will appreciate if you have to drink some whiskey here.
A bientôt.
Bientôt.
And Mark, we're going to now trace some of the history of your grandfather and how he got here on that fateful day. This is Nantes Atlantique Airport as is now, but back in 1940 still RAF Bouguenais. But they must have had an indication that things weren't going well. I mean, Dunkirk had been evacuated, Winston Churchill had broadcast that the expeditionary force had been safely transported across the Channel. Did the boys think they'd been left behind?
Yeah, well, in fact, on the 14th of June, they were sitting not far from here listening to the BBC World Service when Winston Churchill came on and announced that the British Expeditionary Force had completely and successfully evacuated France. In fact, at that point, there was still 150,000 plus British troops still in France, still trying to evacuate.
Along with many civilians, embassy staff, people who'd been on holiday perhaps.
Exactly.
Mixed in with refugees from Belgium, members of the French forces who perhaps didn't fancy a life under Nazi occupation. So there was a whole gatherings of people who were anxious to get out, and we're about, 50 kilometres from Saint-Nazaire here.
Yeah, it's important to point out, though, there was real chaos. No one really knew what was going on, I mean, partly due to wartime censorship, but the first indication the company got was when their commanding officer pulled them out on parade and said, prepare for evacuation. And I think that was a real shock, especially for my grandfather, because one of the reasons he had volunteered to come to France was to finish the job that his own father had, as he put it, begun in World War I. So to be now in clearly a full retreat was a shock.
So they were on parade on June the 16th, the day before the Lancastria went down. So lined up and said, into the trucks, boys, and we'll be off the Saint-Nazaire, and we'll be evacuated back to Blighty.
Yeah, and tragically for that unit, my grandfather's unit, there was 250 men. A third of the unit were actually killed in the subsequent evacuation.
Let's have a look at the working conditions. Let's see why this was so strategically important. We're in the control building of RAF Bouguenais, one of only two like it standing in the world. What does it feel like retracing your grandfather Walter's footsteps?
I feel a real sense of affinity with this building. This is not the first time I've been here, but you know, in a very tangible way, this was a building that my grandfather knew. He saw it every day that he was stationed here. And for all that the events around my grandfather being here are shrouded in disaster, for the period leading up to the evacuation, these were very happy times for my grandfather. So, of
course, he and the rest of the squadron, his unit, had no idea they were about to be involved in the greatest maritime disaster in British history when they left here.
It was kind of a tinge of sadness, I think, that they were leaving. But I think there was an expectation that they would ultimately return. I think for my granddad, for the other men, you know, it was a sense of defeat. I mean, you couldn't hide the fact that this was an unmitigated retreat.
On the morning of June the 17th, 1940, Captain Sharp, in command of Lancastria, received an order from the Admiralty. It told him to load as many men as possible without regard to the limits laid down by maritime law. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, more than 6,000 people, exhausted soldiers, confused refugees, were crowded onto the ship, more than 3 times its established capacity limit. At that point, Captain Sharp made a fateful decision to stay at anchor and not to make a dash for home. He was understandably frightened that without a destroyer escort, his ship would be easy prey to U-boats in the English Channel. A major air raid began at 3:45, and at 3:48, the Lancastria, anchored 10 nautical miles off Saint-Nazaire, suffered 3 direct hits from a squadron of Junker aircraft. Just after 4 o'clock, the Lancastria began to capsize and then sank within 20 minutes. The fuel oil in the sea ignited. The Luftwaffe strafed the survivors in the water. Only 5 of Lancastria's 32 lifeboats were successfully launched. By the time the smoke had cleared and the carnage was over, 2,477 people had somehow managed to scramble to safety aboard one of the accompanying ships. The trawler Cambridgeshire, on its own, lifted 900 people from the burning water. But even these heroic efforts meant that perhaps 4,000 people had died. Certainly the biggest loss of life in British maritime history. Perhaps 1/3 of the entire casualty rate of the British Expeditionary Force in France. And the relatives, they were told only that their loved ones had died with the BAF. They were given no more details. Even recently, people have been looking for the remains of their loved ones and found they were buried respectfully in cemeteries like this in La Boule because they'd been washed ashore and weren't cradled in the deep with the Lancastria. Join us after the break to find out more about how Brittany has commemorated the greatest single loss of life in British maritime history. Welcome back. We're telling the story of the Lancastria, the greatest maritime disaster in British history, but one kept secret from the people by a wartime news blackout. But what was the impact of the loss of the Lancastria to the communities here in Brittany? No one knows these waters better than former fisherman and captain of the Loire Pilot Service, Captain Yves Beaujouge. As a boy fishing in the estuary, the remains of the Lancastria victims were caught in his nets. As a man, he founded the Association Lancastria de France. Captain Yves Beaujouge, as president of the Association Lancastria de France, you've made it almost a personal mission to explain the circumstances of the loss of that great ship.
Effectivement, Alex, tu as entièrement raison. Le but de notre association, c'est premièrement que cette histoire ne soit jamais oubliée.
The first aim of the association is that the story can never be forgotten. Then to help the families understand, to know exactly where the site of the shipwreck is. There are 53 cemeteries in the west of France where they are located. And also to give honor to all the victims and survivors of the Lancastria.
Du Lancastria. Et surtout, Alex, c'est pour honorer la mémoire des victimes du Lancastria.
Why do you feel that the loss of the Lancastria, the greatest loss of life in a single ship sinking in the whole of British naval history, why do you feel it's not remembered more as it should be?
Effectivement, pour moi, ça restera toujours l'une des premières catastrophes maritimes de tous les temps. Comme je viens de te le dire, 53 cimetières.
In fact, for me, it will remain the worst maritime disaster ever. And can you imagine the victim rest in peace in 53 cemeteries? And can you also imagine that exactly 6 months after the sinking, a body came into Bordeaux? So far, it will remain the worst maritime disaster ever.
Maritime, même si nous étions en temps de guerre, ça reste quand même la catastrophe. C'est 3 fois pire que le Titanic. 3 fois pire que le Titanic. Et encore, nous ne connaissons pas le nombre, nous avons juste une estimation du nombre de victimes.
Well, Captain, I can't thank you for all the work you've done, but what I can do is present you with the Salmond Quaich, the Loving Cup, for being on the show. You know the drill. Vous savez quoi en faire. Salmond écossais, le whisky.
Ah, ok. J'adore le whisky écossais, ça va très bien. Merci beaucoup, Alex. Merci de votre visite, c'est très sympathique. Et surtout, merci.
Catherine Tezer has served as a council member in Saint-Nazaire with responsibility for Veterans Affairs and Ceremonies. Madame Catherine Tezer, what is it about the story of the Lancastria which touches the hearts of the people of Saint-Nazaire?
Ils sont touchés à plusieurs niveaux parce que l'histoire, tout simplement...
The situation was very complex on the 17th of June. That's why people do remember this date, because the situation in France was very critical. With Marshal Pétain's appeal for the armistice, also because the Allies and troops were going back, people here in Saint-Nazaire were afraid of them leaving. And finally there was the sinking of the Lancastria, which was a real disaster. People here never forget this huge memory that remains in Saint-Nazaire with the tragedy of the Lancastria.
De les enterrer dignement et de leur rendre les honneurs.
Catherine, for all that you've done to commemorate the loss of the people in the Lancastria, can I present you with the Salmond Quaich, a loving cup for whisky, Salmond écossais. You know the drill. Vous savez quoi en faire.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, madame.
Merci.
One of the most remarkable aspects of the Lancastria disaster is that in many ways it's better remembered in France than it is in Britain. And I'm joined by Claude Vigoureau, who's responsible for the department of the French government which looks after Veterans Affairs in this locality. Tell me a bit about what you do locally, Claude.
We serve the memory of the veterans of several wars, and we honor the memory, and we try to help them for social life, orphans, war widows, and victims of terrorism attack too.
You've attended many such ceremonies, and as indeed have I in other circumstances. A solemnity about the act of remembrance. How do you consider the importance of the act and ceremony of remembrance?
Well, it's so important that today Brexit could cut the fidelity in this memory. Or during 2 world wars, British army and French military were brother in arms. And that is very important. We never mustn't forget this, because these people, they die for us, they die for our liberty today. And I feel deeply concerned as French by the memory of British military who died for us, with us, for freedom with us.
I can't guarantee the continuation of remembrance. I can hope for it certainly, but what I can offer is the quaich, the loving cup, by which remembrance can be properly acknowledged. You know the drill. Vous savez quoi faire. Whiskey in the quaich, and remember properly.
Thank you very much. Let me offer you such a butlet that I laid on each grave of British soldier in Vendée.
Thank you so much, Claude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Christophe, this is the Semaphore Museum. And of course, many ships have been wrecked in this dangerous coastline.
Yeah, really, because before the signals were very simple, you know, with this mast just behind us, and the light came later. And sometimes with the fog and so on, the ships couldn't see the rocks. And also there were battles at sea, and there are some wrecks here in the area, and also the Lancastria.
Please, after you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
This remarkable feature of French remembrance of the Lancastria disaster has also been matched in film. I'm speaking to award-winning film director Christophe Francois, someone who's taken a keen interest in the Lancastria over the years. Christophe, tell us where we are at the present moment.
We are here in Pointe Saint-Gildas. It's South Loire region, and we are at the closest point to the shipwreck. We are about 5 nautical miles far from the shipwreck of the Lancastria.
And this is the old Semaphore station, which has been turned into a very impressive maritime museum, with obviously models of the Lancastria and other of the famous ships which were lost off this coast.
Yeah, exactly. We are here in this museum, in a room which is dedicated to all the sinkings which happened here in the area. And amongst them we have the model of the Lancastria and some artifacts also, which can show you that it was first a liner.
A very luxurious liner, one of the most luxurious of its day in the 1930s.
Exactly, the Lancastria has had a first life as a liner and transported many people on cruises.
And you made an award-winning documentary which was shown across the planet. Tell me what made you make that film, which was so noted and so celebrated.
First, it was shown in France, in our regions. After that, on a national network, and after that, it was shown in 85 countries which can understand French language.
And how did you title the film?
I titled the film Lancastria, the story of a confidential sinking.
Confidential as in secret?
Yeah, exactly. It's still difficult to realize today all the victims of this disaster. And I wanted to make something for these unknown victims who died, who perished here in our region. And it was the most important for me to make this be known by everybody, also in UK.
So thank you so much, Christophe, for using your craft and filmmaking to properly commemorate those who were lost in Lancastria. And as a small token for appearing on the Alex Salmond show, you're entitled to the quaich. Vous savez quoi en faire.
Exactly.
You know the drill.
Yeah.
Whiskey in the quaich.
Whiskey écossais.
The rest is easy.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you.
Monsieur.
Merci beaucoup.
But this lack of official recognition for the victims of Lancastria does not extend to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Here in Pornic, some 30 kilometres from Saint-Nazaire, Christophe Coupé attends to his duties with loving care. Christophe, when was this cemetery here in Pornic first established for the victims of Lancastria?
Ce cimetière a été établi à Pornic en premier lieu après le naufrage de Lancastria.
The cemetery was established at Pornic after the Lancastria disaster. The first victims were buried in the civil cemetery, but due to the massive number of victims found on the coast, it was decided to bury them here, to dedicate the place to the British soldiers who died here.
This is truly a beautiful and very peaceful place, and each year a ceremony is still held to commemorate the victims of the Lancastria.
Yes, every year since 1946, all the Lancastria victims are remembered in this place by the locals. The 18th of June 1940 also means the call to resistance for the French from General de Gaulle.
I think the victims buried here would find that very suitable. Thank you so much. It is perhaps ironic that this commune of Saint-Nazaire should see both the single greatest naval disaster in British history and the most successful commando raid of the Second World War. Here in Saint-Nazaire, both are remembered with touching sensitivity and dignity, but that's not the case back in Blighty. Rudyard Kipling said to the global empire that they should treat triumph and disaster as twin impostors exactly the same. That message was lost on the British authorities when it came to the sinking, the disastrous loss of the Lancastria. And that's caused lasting damage. Firstly, because if warfare is merely a story of triumph, even triumph achieved through sacrifice, then in the words of Robert E. Lee, we risk growing e'er fond of it. These triumphs have to be balanced in remembrance by the unmitigated disasters like the loss of Lancastria. Secondly, because behind the loss of 4,000 souls on the Lancastria lay thousands of families who were denied the proper opportunity to commemorate and mourn their loved ones. Indeed, it took the newspapers in America during the Second World War to break what was an effective blackout of the disastrous news of the Lancastria. The Scotsman was the first domestic newspaper to break the effective embargo. Other outlets followed, but by then the wartime news agenda had moved on to other things. And then the British authorities, and this is the strangest thing, embarked on what has been a 78-year process of at best grudging acknowledgement of the extent of the Lancastria disaster, and at worst what some claim has been a bureaucratic cover-up. However, to every official inaction, there is a people's reaction. And the relatives of those who lost and those who survived in the Lancastria have embarked throughout that period of a campaign to have the memory of their relatives properly commemorated and not lost from history. So join us next week, where we talk to survivors and families about their struggle and why the fate of the Lancastria should not be forgotten. Lest we forget. Nous n'oublions pas.